Now, for this week's presentation, we're very proud to have Ed Tasca with us, who's going to be talking about gun violence. Ed, local humor writer, novelist, and playwright, will deliver a presentation on the complex story of gun violence, focused mainly on the US lust for possession of firearms and the psychology of their misuse, beginning with the US Constitution's Second Amendment. It includes a discussion on the psychopathology behind hyperrage and gun violence, regardless of race, nation, religion, or culture, and offers a view of mental health awareness and treatment requirements that can help identify and treat those who act out violently using firearms, from pistols to military-grade weapons. Okay, so please give a warm and safely distanced welcome to Ed Tasca.
I got up there.
Okay, well done.
Well, good morning to everyone, and I hope everyone can hear me. Yeah, this is a bit of a controversial subject, so please check your weapons at the door if you have them. But it's more, I think, my opinion based on my own research and work than anything else. But here we go. We know now from the news about all the mass murder in the U.S. Just last month, there's been so many occasions that it has become big news. Few have really tried to explain it. Everybody has their favorite theory or interpretation, but nothing has emerged that satisfies all concerned, raising the question of whether it can be explained at all. Certainly we're seeing a dark and eccentric part of the American soul. Those unpinned, tortured, and angry minds, often delusional, and most living on the raw and remote edges of society, but not the first appearance in world history. Today, I want to attempt to deconstruct the problem with some verifiable explanations. The problem being the U.S. taking 25 times the number of gun-related deaths than any other developed nation on the planet. If you're wondering about Mexico in comparison, just last week it was reported that mass killings in Jalisco alone since 2018 surpassed the entire United States, according to the Vallarta Daily. But this is another story. This is a drug war story for another time. When I hear philosophers today talking about how wonderful the civilized world has become, I have to go get another drink. The evidence for this simply is not there. As for the U.S., let's start off with what I have called the breech birth of the infamous Second Amendment. This is not a put down of the amendment, but a review of its history and abuse. Many ask, how could America's brilliant founding fathers, products of the Enlightenment, men of learning and culture, have so casually conceived a declaration as broad and unqualified as the Second Amendment to America's admired and often emulated federal Constitution? According to the loose interpretation of its wording, the amendment gives everybody in the nation the right to own and carry any weapons invented then and now, with the right to eventually target everything from game to what recent American experience tells us could be suspicious young men in hoodies. It's 1790. Over 200 years ago. The war for independence is over. The American Constitution is being amended with a Bill of Rights. First, the Second Amendment states a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state is the right of the people to keep and bear arms and shall not be infringed. That's not the wording. I've added an extra word there because I think it needed a clarification. I've added the word is the right. The regulated militia is the right of the people to bear arms. Without the word is, the amendment sounds like it's a well-regulated militia is okay, and also the right of the people to keep and bear arms is okay. But I'm certain, from my background in linguistics, that that's not what was intended in the wording. I give you that as my opinion. Second, the only relevant issue that created any debate around the wording at the time was the subject of dueling. After years of arguing over dueling's pros and cons, using a pair of dueling pistols was eventually outlawed federally around 1800. Most duels were fought over either political differences, business fraud, and of course women. But the issue does point to the framers' concern about weapons being used by citizens against one another. That's why it was eventually banned. This has seldom been pointed out when the amendment's intentions are discussed. But it is a telling issue about the Founding Fathers' intentions. Okay, third, the amendment was originally intended to authorize each community to arm what we today would call a police force for the purpose of protecting against enemies from within and from abroad. Enemies that in actuality at the time existed only through an imagined post-war fear, suspicion, and paranoia. Innocent and polite rogues from Newfoundland who wanted to join the Union. Any Canadians here? Who wanted to join the Union? The Spanish controlling the South who had no interest in climates below 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 degrees centigrade. French non-combatants in the West happily collecting war debts from the new nation. Native Americans who had already been shuffled off past the Mississippi River and were really no threat. And of course, any underhanded assaults from the new federal and local governments. Now, these were all unlikely threats at the time. And remember, the mafia had not yet arrived. Fourth, the amendment was never meant as a Wild West free-for-all of self-reliance and independence by carrying any and all personal firearms. Dodge City was decades away. The first clue here is well-regulated militia. An idiot with an open carry AR-15 is not a well-regulated militia. He's probably not even a well-regulated human being. So, let's look at the 18th century warriors intended by the amendment to be permitted to use the relevant firearms that were available at the time. The militia. Everybody knows about the militia. At the time, as I said, there really weren't any existential threats anywhere, except that the recent experience with the British left common folk with a sense of helplessness, because governance to them meant governing bodies could disarm you, take away your means of protection as they see fit, which of course is what the British did when the colonial rebellion struck. So, a nation needs to have the armed militias as a right by law. Not just a gathering of people with guns, but as a right by law. But history tells us that these post-war local militias never really caught on with any degree of dedication or even organization. Because, one, militia membership was tedious. It was a low-paying job that interfered with a man's personal life and his family life, not to mention the time he could spend in the tavern. A militiaman had to provide his weapon at his own cost. The purchase price of muskets could be quite high then, averaging around $12. $12 could have been a monthly salary for many, circa 1790. 3, militiamen also had to pay for sufficient ball, powder, flints, and miscellaneous cleaning gear, when all they really wanted was that newfangled rocking chair that America had just invented, honestly, right at the same time. New England, somebody in New England. Somebody said later on, they'll leave it to the Americans to keep moving while they're sitting. Most importantly, it was post-war. Men were tired of fighting. And what do men do when they're tired of fighting? They have babies, lots of babies. So there was a baby boom, and wives said, forget the militia and the rocking chair. Get ye posterior out to a good job. These are understandable human demands. So, militia recruits were actually in short supply. This was America's first step to a culture of gun self-reliance. The other half of the story, the famous musket, at 6 feet tall, the ungainly musket wasn't just a weapon. It was a high-maintenance obligation, harder to keep clean than a dune buggy. What's worse, for most muskets, their reputation for reliability went something like this. Each musket needed constant care to keep the barrel free of ash or soot, and, of course, corrosion. Or else one shot could cost the shooter an eyeball. 2, in battle, if there was any humidity in the air, or if the firer's hands were sweaty, which they often were considering the owner's anxiety over a lost eyeball, the shot could land you on your butt looking around for your thumbs. 3, it took 20 seconds to load one shot in a musket and fire. This while the enemies were about to skewer you with bayonets. Muskets seldom hit anything beyond a few meters away, at least not intentionally. Remember Alexander Dumas' Musketeers? Those dashing, clever, feared heroes from the famous novel? Ever see them depicted with the namesake musket? No. A well-handled sword was more formidable at the time. The infamous musket was invented in the late 1400s and hadn't changed much in 300 years. 300 years, one weapon. History tells us that pitchforks and axes were more often the preferred weapon by over 25% of American soldiers during the War of Independence. Although low tech for the time, the pitchfork and the axe generally landed where you pointed them. So, at the time of the writing of the Second Amendment, musket availability and use seemed innocuous to the writers of the Bill of Rights, meaning musket ownership was of little concern in private hands and dangerous only if you tripped over one. This was true for as long as 70 years, until the next big ballistics breakthrough around 1860, just around the time of the Civil War. That would be the more forbidding breech-loading Springfield rifle. This was a serious, accurate, and fast-firing weapon. But it was unimaginable in 1790. So the Second Amendment was conceived around these innocuous realities. The vote was in, an all-male vote, of course. Let everybody snap up a weapon if they like, hang it over their hearth to look tough and prepared. And then if you really wanted to hunt, you let American natives teach you how to use a bow and arrow. Okay, so what could go wrong? Let's jump ahead. The National Rifle Association. NRA and other pro-gun advisories pushed the swagger that accompanied firearm use, a trope portrayed regularly and often in American action and mob movies, and as a part of the Wild West mythology, which it must be noted, really, they're still very popular forms of entertainment worldwide. Time magazine explained in 1990 that the NRA was founded in 1871 by the Civil War's former Union Army officers who were unhappy that so many Northern soldiers were poorly trained and incapable of using their weapons. This, of course, put their lives in danger as soldiers or members of a militia. It then cited the success of Britain's National Rifle Association and proposed that the U.S. National Guard organize such a club to instruct gun use. It was a club of the few people that were interested in marksmanship and so on. America's National Rifle Association would ultimately and regrettably turn to private enterprise for expediency, for funding, and entrepreneurship. In the mid-20th century, the Second Amendment's right of the people to keep and bear arms should not be infringed. Wording would become an NRA rallying cry, knocking the Second Amendment's original intent off the charts of common sense. Private enterprise meant big money, and big money could be very persuasive, if sometimes misguided. Often, democracy's Achilles heel. An obsession was born. The NRA entangled gun possession and masculine empowerment and made it its psychological foundation, if only obliquely. May not have said so directly. It would promote this positioning and its own continued rise in influence over the next 150 years. In fact, it's their 150th anniversary this year. Many Americans will stand and toast them and then duck when a car backfires. Now, along the way, we might ask, were there any precedents in the U.S. for the banning of automatic weapons? It's a good question. It's a thoughtful question. Despite the notoriety and its iconic history, the Thompson submachine gun was one of the first weapons subject to the 1934 National Firearms Act, which prohibited the use of all automatic and concealable weapons by civilians in the United States. But the act was toothless. In a nutshell, it demanded a stiff tax to be paid for the sale or transfer of sawed-off shotguns. Remember how everybody was aghast over them in black and white movies with characters with Italian-sounding names?
Yeah.
They banned sawed-off shotguns because they thought sawed-off shotguns were an unfair weapon. They also banned concealed weapons, meaning the compact machine gun, the Tommy gun, as it was known. I don't know if anyone remembers that. But not handguns. This was all in an effort to thwart growing gangland violence, not citizen-on-citizen assaults. So the act really became a footnote in history. At the same time, the NRA continued to push the proliferation of guns and other firearms as a source of personal power and a means of defense in the face of gangland violence at first. No other country has had a gun lobby with this kind of psychological influence on its entire citizenry. Okay, so now, let's jump ahead again. Let's look at today's mental health map. There are about 250 million Americans aged 15 and over today. And Robert Hare, a renowned scholar of pathological personalities, estimates that roughly 1% of any population, anywhere, is pathological. Some of us here, possibly. He further speculates conservatively that about 1/4 of those are potentially violent, and slightly fewer are without conscience entirely. That means that on any given day, over 600,000 potentially violent psychopaths of age 15 and up are on the loose in the United States and waiting for the right trigger to set them off. Some types of these psychopaths can burst onto the scene unexpected because by their natural ability to remain hidden, they are almost always a nice, quiet, helpful guy who rescued somebody's cat. Other types are more openly outspoken. For example, we have today, unfortunately, QAnon followers and their fearfulness over conspiracies they themselves have largely invented. As a social psychologist, Sofia Moskalenko of Georgia State University studies terrorists and those who commit irrational acts of violence. During her research on gun violence, she said, I noticed that QAnon followers who number in the millions in the US are different from regular militants. They are far more likely to have serious mental illnesses. They are far more likely, they are at the tip of 68% of QAnon followers who have revealed in their own words on social media or in interviews that they underwent a wide range of mental health diagnoses. Let me say that again. 68% of QAnon followers have, in their own words, admitted to having a range of mental health diagnoses. including things like post-traumatic stress disorder, bipolar disorder, anxiety, depression, paranoid schizophrenia, and addictions. Then she says that by contrast to the 68%, less than 19% of all Americans have had a mental health diagnosis. That's an outsized difference. Remember the good old days when a murderer was just a bad guy? No psychology was ever needed to figure him out. The James Cagney model. He was just a bad guy who shot people. That was it. Today it's a much more complicated issue. Today we are more aware of the psychopathy behind homicides, behind mass killings, and irrational violent behavior. The FBI now has statistics that show only a small number of gun deaths are caused during or as a result of a crime. The rest have no motive but derangement, hate, xenophobia, or paranoia. It's a disturbing fact. Finally, gun violence is also the hate child of fear and weakness. Many react to their fears and paranoia against those perceived to be threats to society with frantic acts of irrational behavior, often stemming from myths and conspiracies which the like-minded seem to agree upon, encourage, and propagate. The easy access to guns is a ready solution to eliminate these perceived threats. These people and their crazy actions can happen in any culture, any era, and any nation. But America's gun load, seemingly everywhere, makes gun violence more likely and more horrendous. My opinion, please. So what needs to be done? There is a self-evident need to raise this mental health issue and this tendency for irrational violence to a higher level of mental health priority, because the scientific community is calling this an epidemic in the U.S. Mental disorders are no longer the work of the devil. They are as much a part of humanity as our biome. They are inside us. Understanding the human condition, or why we are the way we are, is the all-important task facing humanity. Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson recognized this back in the 80s. The human condition is the most important frontier of the natural sciences, and our only potential for the psychological rehabilitation of the human race is studying human behavior and understanding. This was the theme of just about all of his work. Yet there has been a great deal of dismissiveness. No idea will be more fiercely resisted than the explanation of the human condition, because its exposure and understanding is something few are comfortable with. That's a human truism. It's about our level of self-awareness. Science needs to make us self-aware. My very first childhood best friend, with whom I spent a lot of time, turned out to be a murderer. Not a mass murderer, but a young man angry enough to kill someone in cold blood. At the time, very little science was being applied to predicting violent behavior. But I saw hints of the strange, agitated aggression in my friend when we were 8 years old. He had no awareness of it. Was he a born killer? We don't yet have any definitive answer. I personally believe killers are born with the potential, but not the inevitability. They do leave tells. And often these are deep-seated anger and disappointment manifested by domestic violence, hateful belief systems, or religious, political, or racial bigotry. Even the wounds and scars of childhood can derange a person's mind and leave many, many without a conscience. We call violent behavior personality disorders. They haven't disappeared with evolution or a more civilized world. Another reason why we must attempt to understand them at a deeper level. Funding healthcare across the board, funding mental health research, these are as important as studying the means to better cardiovascular health or cognitive health, or even cancer prevention. Psychology, as the science of human behavior, is one of the most vital sciences these days, and yet we remain in the scientific dark ages on the subject. The NRA's version of the Second Amendment propels the myth that if everyone has a gun, everyone will be safe. Doesn't seem to be true, though. Stats, especially over the last several decades, just simply don't bear this out. The U.S. owns over 1/3 of all the guns possessed individually on the planet. But only 3% of the population owns 50% of the guns in America. Evidence that gun possession is an obsession of a few and not the entire nation. Gun restrictions, automatic weapon prohibitions, and gun licensing requiring serious background checks need to be bolstered to be effective, but they are only a first step. Next are major steps to limit the myths of gun ownership, acquisition, and idolatry. Here are some of the reasons Americans will tell you they obsess over gun ownership, because those, beyond those whose occupation requires it, in descending order of what appears most understandable and socially acceptable. Here's what they are. Number one, the sheer fun of our Wild West history with firearms. They really mean a capacity to intimidate. These are just nut jobs. Number two, fear of bringing a fist fight to a gunfight. Propagated by the media and pop culture that guns solve conflicts very quickly. Three, self-aggrandizement. It can be cool and sexy to flash a gun around. Four, hidden fears and paranoia over perceived threats. Perceived threats. Five, an arrogant thumb in the eye to the establishment and to distrusted politicians. We'll do it our way. Six, non-threatening self-reliance for security's sake. It's ages old in American culture. And finally, seven, safety-conscious hunters and hobbyists and sportsmen after marksmanship skills. These are the safest, most reasonable people who possess guns. They take care. They lock them up. They hide the ammunition. They do all the things that make gun ownership safe. I'm no authority on categories of motivation. But what I can say is I've known someone who falls into each of those aforementioned categories. That's why I itemized them here. The interpretations of the Second Amendment are now under scrutiny once again, as of March this year, on the constitutional right to carry a gun around in public. The right was shot down by a lower court. The ban was shut down by, the right was shot down by a lower court, the Ninth Circuit Court. But now, this issue is at the conservative-leaning Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court, it is very likely to be dismissed based on Supreme Court history around these gun regulatory issues. But the other side of this coin is that the Ninth Circuit Court did establish precedent against carrying a gun, meaning the Supreme Court would have to bend over backwards to find a way to strike down that precedent. We'll wait and see. But this court ruling is the momentum that gun activists and need to continue fighting against the brain-dead idea that guns need to be everywhere. Again, my opinion. Finally, here's the interesting thing, and it proves my point all along, about the origins and the purpose of the Second Amendment. Most political officials claim, and you will recognize this, that they are afraid of gun prohibitions because their constituents believe somebody is going to come and take their guns away. It's exactly the premise I pointed out for the birth of the Second Amendment in the very first place. It's like gun enthusiasts are still living under the onus of another British invasion. There is no imaginable way any agency can take anybody's guns away. Can't be done. So it is my belief that we're left with the perversion of the original innocent intentions of the Second Amendment. Psychological understanding of this issue may arrive someday, given that several books have been and will continue to be published for children on the nature of gun violence and how to deal with it and understand it. So it is our children and their proper understanding of the issue that may serve to heal America's social disorder and ongoing tragedies and change this unimaginable crisis in the future. Thank you.